14th century anchoress and mystic Julian of Norwich in the first chapter of the long text of Showings, her divine revelations of God's love. To our contemporary ears, this desire Julian expresses sounds strange, perhaps even slightly morbid and masochistic. In a world so wounded, who is it that asks for more wounds? For we know we live in a wounded world. In these past 2 years, experiencing the global pandemic have exacerbated and exposed this deep woundedness. There has been a collective sense of brokenness, of pain, a sense of alienation and estrangement from what we have hoped for in our lives. And in the midst of these past 2 years, we have also witnessed the wounds of systemic racism, sexism, and ideological warfare in our own nation that continues to rip communities apart. We continue to witness the woundedness of the earth. We are aware of the deep wounds of violence and disease, of mental health crises and drug addiction. We are even becoming more aware through studies of how the wounds of generational trauma are passed down in and through our very bodies. And as today we collect donations to support the critical work of the Friendship Center here in Helena, we are acutely aware of the wounds inflicted through intimate partner violence and sexual assault. In addition to these collective wounds, each of us carries our own wounds, some visible, carried physically through scars or ailments, limps or changes to our daily abilities, through injury, illness, or just the everyday slow decay of the body. And so many of our wounds are hidden from sight, buried deep in our bodies and our hearts. Wounds of loss, of grief, of loneliness, past traumas, lost dreams unfulfilled. Why, oh why, would someone ask for more wounds? And yet, this is what Julian requests. 3 wounds: the wound of true contrition, the wound of loving compassion, and the wound of longing for God. And it is the second wound she requests that I wish to reflect on today, the wound of loving compassion. Because even if we're bothered by this request for wounds, my guess is that many of us sense an inkling of wisdom or of truth in this request. For each of us here has probably experienced the reality that when we draw near to the suffering of others, when we act with compassion, or when we receive compassion from another, we touch on some divine truth of what it means to be human. Our capacity and our desire to feel, to empathize, to journey with those in dire suffering points to this reality. Cast in Julian's foundational conviction of the saving power of God's divine, compassionate love, this wound of loving compassion can give us insight into our own call to bear and show loving compassion in and to the wounded world. Now, you might be sitting there wondering, this is all great, but who is Julian of Norwich? So I will give you a little introduction into who she is and the little bit we know of her life. I will say it's interesting in the past couple of years in the midst of the pandemic, Julian has been brought up a lot in popular theology. She's really been heralded as a mystic for our time. And I think there's some really important truth to that. Julian lived in a time of great political and ecclesial turmoil in Norwich, England, in the 14th century. The 100 Years' War waxed and waned throughout the 14th century, leaving a wake of dead as well as traumatized soldiers throughout England and France. The hierarchy of the Catholic Church was in the upheaval of the Western Schism, when two different men claimed the right to the papacy, causing political and ecclesial unrest. A good thing to remember when we think the church is in chaos right now, right? Closer to home, around the year 1351, a famine struck England and really affected Norwich. In fact, so much that it caused a riot to break out among the peasants in Norwich, and it was squashed only when the local ordinary returned and violently reprimanded the rioters. And of course, probably what we're most familiar with in the narrative of the Middle Ages, the Black Death swept through England, reaching its peak in 1348, when Julian was just a child. The Black Death, as we can imagine, traumatized entire communities, not only physically, but psychologically and spiritually as well. The dominant theology of the Middle Ages placed great emphasis on the teaching that anyone who died in mortal sin without receiving absolution or last rites would be eternally damned. People died by the hundreds each day, and the priests could not keep up with the number of deaths. And the poor, of course, were most affected by this lack of spiritual care. There was such fear that those who died without receiving last rites were damned for all eternity. It caused great spiritual suffering. Church authorities took advantage of people's fear of eternal damnation. And in the 1360s, Urban VI, one of the popes, commissioned the Bishop of Norwich to lead a crusade against the other pope in Avignon, Clement VII. Urban VI promised indulgences to anyone who was willing to support the crusade. And he even extended this promise, this indulgence, to anyone who participated, to their loved ones who had already died. People were more than willing to hand over their lives as well as their silver and gold in exchange for the salvation of the souls of their loved ones. But the crusade was ultimately a failure, and many people returned to England feeling betrayed and abandoned by the church. This is the context in which Julian lived. We do not know the ways in which she was personally affected by the plague or the political and social realities of her time, but her writings certainly reflect a deep understanding of the realities of suffering and pain of the afflicted, particularly the peasants of Norwich, those most vulnerable and socially precarious. And we do know that she herself experienced a grave illness when she was about 30 years old. In fact, during this illness, she was so close to death that a priest was called in to offer her last rites. And during this experience of the last rites, as the priest placed the crucifix before her face, it was then that Julian received the 16 revelations from Jesus Christ, whom she referred to as our endless bliss, our beloved, our mother. As she looked on the crucifix, she came to a deep revelation of the love of God expressed on the cross. She described these 16 revelations as showings. And in these visions, she was brought to the foot of the cross, where she witnessed in great detail the suffering of Christ. In this, she speaks intimately with Christ as he is upon the cross. And in this intimate exchange, she comes to know the depth of transformative, salvific love that is revealed in Christ's suffering and death. Miraculously, she survived the illness. And she decides, after surviving, to become an Anchorite. She enters an anchor hold in the Church of St. Julian in Norwich. And she dedicated the rest of her life to prayer and reflection on the revelations received, to write them down and to offer them as solace to the world. You might not be familiar with the Anchorite Movement, but it was very popular during the time of Julian. Anchorite comes from the Greek word meaning to retire, and that is precisely what an Anchorite did. They retired from the world to live in a small, modest cell called an anchor hold, attached to a church, usually at the center of town. Before they entered the anchor hold, the person would receive the sacrament of last rites, a radical sacramental declaration of their dying to self and to the world. Many, like Julian, even erased their birth name, taking instead the name of the church in which they served. That's why we don't actually know her real name. The community would support the anchoress with food, shelter, and a servant to take care of the household needs in exchange for the anchoress's prayers and spiritual guidance. Their role was seen as critical, to be contemplatives focused on the inner life and praying for the salvation of the community. They also then offered personal spiritual direction to those in the community who would come to their window, sit outside, and speak with them. So their ministry was clear: pray and be available to offer spiritual guidance and solace. Julian was such an anchoress. She was a contemplative whose dedication to prayer, silence, and reflection certainly provided her the space and opportunity to write her profound spiritual insights and wisdom regarding God's divine love for humanity. Her own experience of suffering and near death gave her the capacity and the courage to share this insight with anyone who drew near to her window. Her life as an Anchorite was one way that she was able to assuage the pain and suffering of so many in the community. So for the next 20 years or so, she reflected on those 16 revelations. And as I've said, at the heart of her theological reflection was this great assurance and conviction of God's divine love for all of humanity and God's deep longing and thirst to draw humanity close. The entire message she wished to share is summed up in her repeated conviction: all will be well, all will be well, all matter of things will be well. It is no wonder that a message of love and insight, like love and light that Julian offered, would have brought many distressed souls comfort and peace during such a time of unimaginable suffering. To understand Julian's conviction that all will be well, we must take a look at the revelation she received while in the presence of Christ's suffering on the cross. In the beginning of showings, Julian first reflects on the revelation she receives of God assuring her of God's love. After this assurance, she is then led to the foot of the cross. She sees and describes in great detail the bodily suffering Jesus endures. She bears witness to and describes his scourging. She describes in depth the bleeding, the crowning of thorns, the death-like pallor of his face. She describes the wound in his side, the blood outpoured. She speaks of his cry, "I thirst." She finally witnesses his death. And yet, as she witnesses to and describes this bodily woundedness and suffering, she simultaneously bears witness to the spiritual revelation she receives as she witnesses the immensity of his love for humanity. Here is one of the more well-known passages that expresses this. "At the same time, I saw this sight of the head bleeding. Our good Lord showed me a spiritual sight of his familiar love. I saw that he is to us everything which is good and comforting for our help. He is our clothing, who wraps and enfolds us for love, embraces us and shelters us, surrounds us for his love, which is so tender that he may never desert us. And so, in this sight, I saw that he is everything which is good, as I understand. And in this, he showed me something small, no bigger than a hazelnut, lying in the palm of my hand, and it was as round as a ball. I looked at it with the eye of my understanding and thought, what can this be? I was amazed that it could last, for I thought because of its littleness, it would suddenly have fallen into nothing. And I was answered, it lasts and always will, because God loves it. And thus everything has being through the love of God. As she testifies to the immensity of love and the immensity of pain of Jesus on the cross, she too is filled with pain. The pain she experiences is not identified with Christ's pain, but rather she sees her pain that she experiences joined to the sorrow and the pain of the disciples at the foot of the cross. She speaks of Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and the beloved disciple. With them, she stands at the foot of the cross, present and extending compassion to Christ's suffering. She writes of this, "The revelation of Christ's pains filled me full of pains. For I know well that he suffered only once, but it was his will to show it to me now and fill me with mind of it. So I had asked before. I thought, is there any pain in hell like this? And in my reason, I was answered, hell is a different pain, for in it there is despair. But of all the pains that lead to salvation, this is the greatest, to see the lover suffer. How could any pain be greater than to see him who is to all my life, all my bliss, and all my joy suffer? Here I felt unshakably that I loved Christ so much more than myself that there was no pain which could be suffered like the sorrow which I felt to see him in pain. It's here, I believe, that she receives that wound of loving compassion she requested earlier. She recognizes this experience of pain as a testament to the deep love she has for Jesus. So what is revealed to her is not only the depth of love God has for her, but she also comes to understand her own capacity to participate in this love by extending it toward the one suffering. We may be able to recognize this in our own life. When we see someone we love suffer, we feel their pain. We wish to take it from them, to bear it for them. Strangely, when we are compassionately present to another's pain, we come to catch a glimpse of the depth of the love we have for them. There is a paradox here, of course. It's often in the excruciating throes of suffering that we come to know the face of love. As the revelations continue, Julian remains at the cross. Although she wishes to look away, she doesn't. And as she watches with all her might, as she describes it, she reflects on the next revelation. Just at the moment when, by appearances, it seemed to me that life could not last, and that the revelation of his end must be near. Suddenly, as I looked at the same cross, he changed to an appearance of joy. The change in his blessed appearance changed mine, and I was glad and joyful as I could possibly be. Fully present to Christ's suffering, she comes to witness Christ's joy. Here she tells us that, yes, humanity shares in the suffering of Christ, and Christ enters into the sufferings of humanity. But, Julian tells us, this is not all. We can also find comfort that suffering is transformed into joy, into bliss, into tender love. And we who dare to draw close will share in the divine joy that outlasts any pain, suffering, or death. By drawing close to his suffering, she also draws close to his joy, to his tender love, to the truth that which lasts is not the pain, not the suffering, but the love, the tender intimacy God desires to have with us. The wound of loving compassion opens space for true joy and bliss that can only come from knowing how to love deeply and tenderly. Had she looked away, had she resisted the cross, she would have missed it. We can learn from this wisdom to close ourselves off from the suffering of our neighbors, of our friends, our loved ones, even from our own suffering. To ignore it or to look away, we will not be able to witness the joy or the depth of love that is born in the experiences of suffering. The Gospels tell us this too. When the women gather at the tomb, they are the ones who never left Jesus' side. They witnessed it all. They are the ones that go to the tomb, go to the very site of death. And they are the ones who first receive the good news of resurrection. Compassionate presence provides a space to experience the love we have and the love we are capable of. To be the face of love for someone is to draw ever more closely to the mysterious reality of what it means to be human. That is, what it means to be made in the image and likeness of God. Thus, for Julian, the sight of bodily suffering on the wounds of Christ, the visual signs of the wounds, such as the pouring blood, the nailed hands and feet, the pierced side, are transformed into sites of healing. In a provocative section of the text, she describes Jesus inviting her to look at and enter the wound in his side. She writes, "With kindly countenance, our good Lord looked into his side, and he gazed with joy, and with his sweet regard, he drew his creature's understanding into his side by the same wound. And there he revealed a fair and delectable place large enough for all humankind that will be saved and will rest in peace and in love." Julian comes to see that the wounded side of Christ is the resting place for all of humanity, where God gathers us together in peace and love. Interestingly, later on in the text, most famously, I would say, Julian refers at length to Jesus as our mother, the one who nourishes, who feeds and comforts, who draws humanity tenderly to his body. I was thinking about that turn she makes later on in the text and the wound of the side she describes here in this section. It's as though the wounded side is Mother Jesus's life-giving womb. A mark of death becomes a site of new life, of birth. When we are drawn into it, we experience this life, unmarred by sin and death. And she continues, "Our soul will never have rest until he comes into him, acknowledging that he is full of joy, familiar and courteous and blissful and true life." Again and again, our Lord said, "I am he. I am he. I am he who is highest. I am he whom you love. I am he in whom you delight. I am he whom you serve. I am he for whom you long. I am he whom you desire. I am he whom you intend. I am he who is all." Perhaps we have experienced something akin to this in our own lives. When our traumas or our hurts, our griefs, or our losses are offered back to the world as a source of healing. Thinking about the Friendship Center and the work they do, we witness this transformation when it is survivors of sexual assault who courageously offer their comfort to others who experience similar violence. We witness it when recovering addicts dedicate their time and energy to be present to people in the early days of recovery. I see it all the time in my students when they share with me their reasons for wanting to become a teacher, a psychologist, a nurse, a doctor. I've taught numerous pre-med or nursing students who share with me some experience of trauma or loss that fuels their desire to be a doctor or a nurse. We know the power of how our own wisdom learned in and through experiences of grief can be offered as loving compassion back to others through similar suffering. And in this way, our wounds are transformed to sites of life. Our wounds are never erased, but they can be transformed. This is the powerful message of the Paschal mystery, of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The Gospels tell us that Jesus' resurrected body still bears the wounds of crucifixion. They are transformed, yes, but they are not erased. Resurrection does not undo the crucifixion, it transforms it. The cross, a sign of death and abandonment, becomes the place of new life and communion. By entering the side, by entering the suffering of Christ, Julian herself begins to glimpse the depth of love God has for us, God's longing for us. Not only does this fill her with compassion for Christ, it fills her with compassion for, quote, her fellow Christians. This is compassion, she insists, that must be shared. And she says this, just as I was before filled full of pain and compassion on account of Christ's passion, so I was now in part filled with compassion for my fellow Christians, because he loves very deeply the people who will be saved, that is to say, all God's servants. If you were sitting out there a little disturbed by all of this focus on suffering, you're not alone. There is a danger, I think, in our emphasis, when we emphasize suffering, that we can begin to glorify suffering. And we know great harm can be done with any glorification of suffering. Too easily, suffering can be turned into something that should be sought out, or worse, to be borne silently or offered up. And throughout history, the glorification of suffering, particularly through a misuse of the symbol of the cross, has been used by people in power to justify perpetuating systems of oppression, particularly against women, people of color, and other marginalized groups. So I must insist here that we must protest against that form or justification for human suffering. And I want to be clear, that is not Julian's theology. Far from accepting and glorifying suffering and sin for its own sake, Julian, after this long reflection on the suffering of Christ, questions its very existence. In the middle of her conversation with Jesus, right after she's been assured of his passionate love for humanity, she writes, "And so in my folly, before this time, I often wondered why, through the great prescient wisdom of God, the beginning of sin was not prevented. For then it seemed to me that all would have been well." Julian does not bypass the most perplexing of human questions. How can a God be all-powerful, all-loving, all-gracious, all-saving, and still allow such horrific suffering and sin? Julian repeats this question again and again. Why did God do it this way? Why sin? Why suffering? Why death? Why? Julian does receive a response from Jesus in a rather problematic translation, and if I had more time, I'd go way into this. You can take my class next fall if you want, but this is the response she receives. "Sin is necessary, but all will be well, and all will be well, and every kind of thing will be well." As I said earlier, this is probably the most famous and oft-quoted line from Dame Julian of Norwich's Theology. What a comforting, consoling mantra. It cultivates a hope, right? Particularly in times of great collective stress and uncertainty. And colleagues out there know it's at the bottom of all my emails since the pandemic started. All will be well, all will be well, all will be well. Yet, as with any words of comfort, it is a mantra that can fall into the danger of sentimentalism, that can become apathetic, cut off from actual suffering. And if misused, It can sound like a dismissive or even unrealistic Hallmark greeting card with hardly a substantive, life-giving theological insight. If emptied of its wisdom, it is right up there with problematic pastoral responses to suffering, such as, "It is what it is." "Oh, offer it up to God." My favorite, "Everything happens for a reason." Or perhaps the worst, "You should be grateful. They're in a better place." We rightfully shudder in the coldness of these responses, and "all will be well" can fall into this if we're not careful. But when situated properly in the wider context of Julian's theological reflection on the divine love of Christ, we, like Julian, can find great consolation in this promise. Because after hearing this assurance that in spite of sin all will be well, Julian describes feeling deeply consoled. Reflecting on the statement, she comes to see that unlike the beloved hazelnut that will last in spite of its littleness, all the seemingly insurmountable sin, suffering, and pain cannot last, for it is not of God. The suffering and pain of sin is real only in the sense that it affects us, but because it is not of God, it bears no substance. It will not last. The comfort is that in the end, all that is real, all that is held in the loving embrace of God, the hazelnut, the tiny sparrow, the lilies of the field, the loved one who dies, they carry on, not the pain, not the sorrow, not the suffering, but the love. While even the smallest hazelnut will last, sin will not. Don't worry, if you're not comforted by this for long, Julian is also not satisfied. She continues to press, "Ah, good Lord, how could all things be well because of the great harm which has come through sin to your creatures?" And I wished for some plainer explanation through which I might be at ease about this matter. Jesus continues to respond to Julian's inquiries. In it, we hear echoes of the book of Job. Job, in the midst of his horrific plight, cries out to God for answers. And like Job, Julian protests to Jesus. And like Job, she does not receive the answer she seeks. As God tells Job, "I am God, you are not." That's my summary of the end of Job, right? I am God, you are not. So too, Julian receives that this is veiled in mystery. Nevertheless, Jesus assures her, all will be well. When we place her mantra, "all will be well," in the wider ambit of her incredulity and protest against sin and suffering, we can almost dare to begin it might be true, without falling into the trap of vapid sentimentalism or cheap grace. Because the line is in future tense. Jesus does not gaslight her. Jesus doesn't say, "All is well, all is well." Jesus says, "All will be well." There is a proper way for the world to be. It is not yet, and God is on it. And we know, along with Julian, that this promise does not come from a distant God who knows nothing of human suffering, because Julian has just walked with Jesus through the suffering of the cross. In fact, Jesus himself cried out the same anguish plea, my God, why? Why have you abandoned me?" And at one point in their intimate conversation, Jesus tells Julian, "If I could have, I would have suffered more. For the sake of humanity, God entered our very suffering, and this is where salvation is found." Julian moves, interestingly, especially for the times, from a theology of the cross that focuses on atonement to one that focuses on accompaniment. In Jesus, God enters the human experience to accompany us in our woundedness. And so, too, are we called to accompany him in his suffering. And of course, we do this not simply by reflecting on the passion and death of Jesus, but by accompanying others, by bearing witness to our wounds of loving compassion. It's in that wound of loving compassion she receives the salvific promise, all will be well. When we trust in the divine love, we gain the courage to enter the fray, to be present to the suffering of others. The transformed wound of Christ gives us the hope that our wounds too can be transformed into a powerful source of healing. So what does this mean for us today? That's the cue that I'm wrapping up, so don't worry if you're wondering. We may wonder about Julian's choice to become an Anchorite. How could a person enclosed in a cell make much of a difference in the lives of others? But I like to see that Julian's anchor hold is not a place of escape. Rather, it is precisely in that enclosure that she opens her heart in loving compassion to the pain and suffering of those in need, the ones who come to her window seeking a word of solace, of healing, to hear all will be well. I've been thinking these past weeks in preparation for this talk of where we may see vestiges of this Anchorite movement in our own times, in our community. And I thought of course, our first responders in the midst of this COVID pandemic, those present to the dying. I think of hospice nurses and caretakers, chaplains, the EMTs who are present at emergencies, a person who holds their friend as they grieve the loss of a parent or a child or a spouse. And the image that keeps coming to mind most ardently, I guess, is thinking about the Friendship Center. Center being an appropriate description. It bears some continuity with that word anchor, I think. It's a place of advocacy. It's a haven for those who are in the throes of violence. And I was picturing in my mind, imagining those volunteers at the Friendship Center who accompany others in times of great need and great trauma. Thinking of someone who is on the other end of a 24-hour hotline, there when someone calls at 2 a.m, 3 a.m, 10 o'clock at night, is a testament to that need we have for others to hold vigil, waiting for those who are in need of loving compassion. When we have the courage to ask, like Julian, for this wound of loving compassion, to be ready to stand witness to and accompany others in their times of suffering and need, we too can participate in God's eternal loving presence. In this we come to know, despite our brokenness, our grief, our sorrows, our wounds will be transformed. And with Julian, we can rest in the promise that all will be well, all will be well, all matter of things will be well. Thank you. Thanks. Now I can be a rock star.
You can be a rock star. Here you go. It's on. It should be working.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Greiner, for such an enlivening and exciting way of orienting us to the theology of accompaniment. We have some time now for a Q&A, and I have a mic. I have the hot mic, and I'll be looking very rude, but I'll be keeping an eye on my phone for those who are joining us by live stream. So they are welcome to join us in the Q&A as well. But feel free to raise your hand, and I'll bring the mic around. So questions for Dr. Greiner?
Yes, Asher.
Why did the Anchorites receive last rites before entering their anchorage?
That is a great question. I don't know if everyone could hear that, but Asher asked, why did the Anchorites receive last rites when they entered the anchor hold? So it actually was a symbolic death. And so last rites is the sacrament received before one dies. And so in that, instead of taking vows like those in religious life would have done, they had this more radical ceremony of really emphasizing the death to self and to the world. And when they entered the anchor hold, they did not leave. And like I said, they often gave up their name and took the name of the church. So it was this just very radical symbol of their death to self and to the world. Great question.
So what were a few of the other revelations? I thought you said there were 16. Do we have to take the class, or?
Sure. Well, okay. So that's a great question. And believe it or not, I've read these so many times, I don't have them all memorized. But part of it is I kind of condensed a lot of them. So what she has, like each of the bodily sufferings is one of the revelations. So for example, she talks about the blood spilled from the crowning of the thorns, and that's one of the revelations, and then she describes what she sees in that. Some of the others are the change of the pallor of his face. But as it goes through, it also moves into these revelations of the Trinity's great love, and then the mothering Jesus. So yeah, there's more, but they're all kind of interwoven, especially in, and this is something I didn't get into, but I'll share it because the question opens it up. So there's actually two versions of the text. There's what's called the short text, which it seems, probably wrote shortly after the experience, and then the long text is what she produces over the next 20 years. And in the long text, which is mostly what I draw from, they're all kind of, she stays focused on the 16 revelations, but they all kind of weave together. And I was actually telling someone as I was working on this, to pull one piece of Julian out is like to undo a thread on a tapestry. And so what you can do, and I can actually talk to you after, I can show you the list of all the 16 revelations at the beginning. But like I said, they're all kind of woven together throughout. Yeah.
A good bridge to an online question. We have a question. Can you recommend a good translation of Julian's teachings?
Oh, yes. I'm going to hesitate. The one I use in class is kind of the most often turned to from the series The Classics of Western Spirituality by Edmund College and Matthew Walsh, I believe. James Walsh. Sorry, James. James Walsh. That's probably the one that is most well known. There's a couple more. The one I really want to get my hands on, and now I can't remember the name of the translators. It's in my Amazon wish list at $250 starting. So that might not be the one you want. And then, how do you say her name? Marabi Starr of the Contemplate. Does anyone know Marabi Starr? I believe that's how you say her first name. She also has a translation that is very popular. So either of those, I think, would be good. Oh,
You mentioned the glorification, the pitfall of glorifying suffering and falling into that. In your study and reflection of this, what were some of the ways that you kind of saw that might be happening, or that could happen, or that does happen in our world now?
In our world now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of it is kind of the residue of kind of old theologies, for lack of that's not a very sophisticated way of saying it, but I think sometimes there's this risk that in reflecting on the suffering of Christ, there have been experiences where people have been told to just bear their sufferings as though it's bearing the cross of their life. So, for example, there are times when women who have been in abusive relationships or abusive marriages have been told, you need to stay in the marriage and just offer it up, right? By offering it up, Christ will be present to you, without also advocating for the one who is experiencing the suffering, right? That's one example, but there are many like that in the ways that the cross is used as almost a weapon of power, right? To keep people in their suffering. Oh, if you just offer it up to Jesus, then we don't have to change anything. And that's where I mean the risk is. Does that make sense? I mean, even in the times of slavery, right? You want slaves becoming Christian, but a particular kind of Christian, right? So not one of protest. And what I love about Julian, what she opens up for us in her conversation, is kind of a protest, right? This was a part that got cut from my talk, so thank you. The question itself, right, why, is one of protest. This isn't how it should be. And when we take that why seriously and say we need to be a source of change of suffering, it changes the tenor of offering it up. Does that? Yeah. I'm going here into the theology of a German theologian, Johann Baptist Metz, who talks about the question itself is what is most important. Not necessarily the justification for suffering, but the question. And I like that Julian does that in the 14th century.
First of all, thank you so much. What a pleasure, a luxury to sit here in the sunshine and listen to you share your wisdom. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Tell us more about how she brings in the mother in her conversation. That's all very new and unfamiliar and fascinating to me.
Oh, thanks. With great pleasure. I should say, Julian gets a lot of credit for talking about Jesus' mother, but she wasn't the first. Bernard of Clairvaux, in his writing, speaks of mothering Jesus. It's actually not an uncommon, well, maybe not, it's still kind of uncommon, but it wasn't unheard of in the Middle Ages and the mysticism of the Middle Ages. But I think what makes Julian so unique is that she herself is a woman, I guess. And there's she places this great emphasis on the second person of the Trinity. So this is the other piece that doesn't even get touched on in my talk, but she has a great Trinitarian theology throughout this text. But she talks of the second person of the Trinity, of Jesus, as mother. And she talks about, just as a mother feeds their child with their own body, so too does Jesus feed his loved ones with his body. So she ties it to a Eucharistic understanding. And she, one of my professors in grad school talked, so this isn't mine, but I'll steal it from her because I think it's brilliant, but she talks about how what Julian is really calling attention to is the nurturing tenderness of God in Jesus and she calls, my professor called it the maternal praxis, that really what is being invited is that all of us should share in that mothering quality of Jesus. So it's not so much gendered, but quality, right? So that the parental experience of nurturing, nourishing, caring for, drawing close to a child is what Jesus does and offers that to the Christian witness. So it's this beautiful turn. And my students are so funny. Some of them get really nervous about it, right? Like, Jesus' mother? Wait a minute. And they, without a doubt, someone will raise their hand and say, but Mary is our mother. Which is, of course, right? And actually, Julian talks at length about Mary, mother of Jesus, mother of God. But there's something so striking about the way she speaks of Mother Jesus. Because, and for me, it makes me wonder if she herself lost her mother. I've kind of always wondered that, or witnessed great mothering from the love of someone else, or perhaps, we don't know, she could have been a mother herself who lost her children, right, to death or disease, which wasn't uncommon. And so that mothering experience really frames her understanding of Christ's nurturing. Yeah. I could pick up the book and just read from that for like hours, but we don't have that kind of time. The sunshine doesn't last that long anymore. So.
We have time for a few more questions. Head to the back and you'll be our last.
Do you see any I don't know. This way? Okay. Do you see any connection between Julian's vision of suffering and the Buddha?
Oh. I was joking with Maren before this that the Q&A is always the part where I'm like, well, I'm always comfortable to say, I don't know. And the reason I don't know, and I'm just going to admit this, I cannot consider myself a scholar of Buddhism, and I think to try right now would be a disservice to the beauty of that tradition. And so I would end up I wouldn't do it justice. But I would be interested in those if there's someone here who is more well-versed in the tradition of Buddhism to offer their insight. It's a great question. Do you want to take a stab at it?
Oh, no, definitely not. But a worthy conversation for after the
Yeah,
talk
I
today.
want to. Can I just say this, but with that caveat that I don't know much? I think. I don't know. I would be curious about the conversation that maybe the Buddha and Julian would have around the question of suffering as entered into, witnessed, but also let go of. And I'm not doing that justice. So you don't need to hear my extroverted thinking on that right now. But it's such a great question.
Take another question?
Sure.
All right.
Shouldn't end on one when I don't know.
Well, this is just a little question. I don't think that she's a saint in the Roman Catholic Church. Do you see that ever happening? She should be.
Well, so maybe not in the formal sense. she's not canonized in that formal sense. But I think now that we've become more familiar with her writings, she's certainly cast in the wider communion of saints, right? And certainly seen in that. I think what makes it tricky in terms of the formal canonization process is we just don't know much about her. And because we didn't really even have access to her texts till about the late 19th century, we didn't even have it. So I think part of it is a coming to know her again that's still occurring. But there's not even we don't even know her name, or, so there's a lot. But I would say that I have no qualms about calling her a saint or referencing her in the great teachings of the Catholic tradition and the Christian tradition, right? And certainly I think our Anglican friends in England certainly bear her as part of the communion of saints.
Well, with that, I apologize. We are going to end our conversation for this afternoon, but Dr. Greiner will continue to stay around for conversations after. Sure. I also welcome you to give a shameless plug for your class upcoming.
Oh, sure. Yes. In the fall 2022, I will teach medieval women mystics. So if you're interested in auditing that, we'd love to have you. Or taking it for credit. You could start a degree in theology next semester.
And the president of the board of the Friendship Center, Katie Loveland, also would like to say a word.
I just want to say thank you, St. Paul's, and thank you, Dr. Greiner. Thank you for mentioning the accompaniment that our organization does. I wanted to mention that we do have upcoming trainings for our crisis line volunteers. It is a 24-hour crisis line, very important accompaniment work. We do accompaniment in the form of responding at the hospital at St. Peter's in the emergency room when folks show up and have experienced sexual assault and have to go through really traumatic examinations and other things. I just think that's such an important accompaniment. We accompany people to the court. Often women or other clients that we serve show up alone to face their abusers, and our staff sit next to them and walk through what can often be a very painful trial. Often women can't afford representation, but they have our advocacy. So anyway, we welcome your donations, but also if you ever want to get involved in that work, very, very difficult work to face what's really happening in our community in terms of violence and abuse, but it's real and important. So thank you. Do you mind if I ask you one more quick question about that?
Sure.
I've reflected very deeply during the pandemic about how our ethos as an organization is to be bodily present in deep trauma. And you talked about how Julian was brought up during the pandemic, but it was such a schism or a break in our work to not be able to show up in person when people were suffering, that we had to shut our doors, and our advocates weren't able to go into the hospital, and the courts were on Zoom, that we weren't able to be in person with people who were deeply, deeply suffering. So I wonder what you've thought about, or what you think Julian would say about a time like this when we can't be bodily present with one another, and maybe what we can learn about that bodily presence as we get to experience it again.
Oh, it's such an important question. I think there's I think we are coming to see just how important that bodily presence is, absolutely. And I guess one comforting thing I see in Julian is kind of the enclosed reality she lived in kept her in a strange way distant, not physically present in the way that we might think about presence. I mean, seriously, the anchor holds are really interesting. They're just this tiny slit of a window. So they could barely even see the anchorite, right? And they would come and just speak through. So there's something kind of powerful in that image that was a source of spiritual solace. At the same time, I don't want to glorify that as an example. That we need to be close. We need that bodily touch. And I guess Julian's own witness to the body of Christ's suffering, right? That she keeps saying throughout, like, I wanted to draw closer and closer. And I think we need that. And the pandemic has, rightfully, we've distanced to protect each other, especially the most vulnerable, but it has also underscored how important that connection is. And so my hope is that in the aftermath of the pandemic, as we hopefully move closer to more vaccinations and into healing from this, that we will be drawing ever closer. I don't know if that helps.
Oh, couldn't end in a more apropos place. Thank you so much, Dr. Greiner, for being with us today.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Join us for future St. Paul's events, or welcome to join us on Sunday mornings at 8:30 and 11 here in the sanctuary or on our live stream. Thank you so much. Donations, again, can be left in the baskets or online. So thank you for coming out.